Hello and welcome to the program. We're currently at the Kyiv Media Week 2018, the largest media forum in Ukraine, where major media players from Ukraine meet other major media players from around the world to discuss the future trend of media worldwide. I'm joined by David Ciaramella, who's Communication Manager at Kyiv Media. Thank you for joining us. Today you're doing a speech in this Kyiv Media Week. What are the main themes that you're talking about?
So this year I'm talking about the FANGs. So for those of you who don't know the FANGs, this is Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix and Google. And we also looked at Snapchat as well. And what these key digital platforms are commissioning, what their strategy is, where programming is concerned. And just to shine a light on what's going on with that. I also presented this morning on kids content as well. So we looked at some interesting examples of kids programming from around the world. And it's good to be back at Kyiv Media Week.
So what can Ukraine have? How can Ukraine have a role into? How you said FANGs? How can it get into this market?
Very easily. I mean, the FANGs are currently looking for producers in several territories around the world, particularly to bolster local production, essentially. So I think that there are definite doors yet to be opened for the Ukrainian market when dealing with particularly with the likes of Netflix and Amazon Prime Video as well. We're seeing that these two platforms in particular are really building up a large base of a large video catalogue that includes productions from around the world in local languages.
Now, one of the main perks of Ukraine is the cost, which is production costs. Here it is cheap, the good locations. But how to ensure that it just doesn't become just a tool, and how to ensure that it's still a creative hive for this market?
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying. You can run the risk of just being a convenient place to shoot, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that what we see now in the Ukraine, particularly this market and others like it, is that there's a real there's a real will to kind of bolster Ukrainian production, independent Ukrainian production. I think it's definitely on the up. I think that some of the companies, the Ukrainian production companies who are here, are doing really interesting things as well. This is, something.
Do you have a concrete example, or?
Let me think.
I'm thinking about animation. You talked about animation, for example. There was the Stolen Princess last year. Now this year is still in production. Is Mafka. Do you see that kind of animation markets growing up in Ukraine?
Certainly, I think that the animation market's a burgeoning market that and this is where Ukraine really has some leverage in the market. That there isn't necessarily. There's no blocks to the production of animation in the Ukraine. So I think it's certainly a very strong point.
Now, one of the main actors in this Kyiv Media Week 2018, and one of the main things is focus on China. Why is it so important for Ukraine to get into this market?
I think it's interesting. I think so. China is a market that is undergoing kind of change, right? It's going through, so the Chinese market currently is going through a state of change. We're in a point of flux. So I think that this is a very, very interesting time for Ukrainian producers to try and enter that market, and distributors to try and work alongside Chinese broadcasters and production companies to come up with IP that suits both parties. I think it's a very, very interesting time for that. I also think that I think that China itself, China has historically been an IP importing country, right? So they have gladly taken IP. Now new government regulations in China mean that that's no longer that's no longer the case as much. So there are now regulations which stem the flow of external ideas going to China. So what they're doing now, we're seeing this rejuvenated creativity from within China, whereby they're coming up with their own format ideas and their own IP, which they're now bringing to the market to sell internationally. So I think it's really interesting. There are some very, very individual ideas as well that we haven't necessarily seen before, because of course they take inspiration from a whole different kind of
universe.
Completely. I mean, they don't even have, you know, I think in the West we sometimes run the risk as format developers of coming up with the same idea, not necessarily because you've stolen a format, just because everybody's reading the same news articles, everybody's looking at the same social media feeds and the same video, whereas China, you know, they don't have Facebook, they don't have such platforms like this, so they're not watching the same content, you know, they're not watching the same videos that may inspire. So, you know, it's a totally whole new pool of inspiration, and I think that leads to these really interesting format ideas.
Now you talked about pool of inspiration. You were working for a Kyiv Media, who's scouting for new ideas, for new trends. What kind of trend can you forecast? Can you foresee during, let's say, 5-10 years to come?
Wow, I think
that's the last question.
Yeah, let me dust off my my magic ball. No, I think. It's a very interesting question. So at K7 we've recently undergone we've produced a report called Top Travelling Formats, right? So this is the top 100 travelling formats from all around the world. And we have collected this data from distributors themselves. So we have asked them to give us their top travelling formats, and we've kind of ranked them worldwide. And from this data, what we can do then is extrapolate these really interesting, you know, we can find this really interesting information within that data that points out, you know, kind of trends by decade, you know. And what we actually find is that actually there isn't a lot of movement. I think that what we're going to see, certainly in the next 5 to 10 years, is broadcasters trying to fight back against the FANGs. So because they see Netflix and Amazon as competition.
So you're saying it's a danger for broadcasters, for what I mean, like traditional broadcasters, they see it as a danger, whether then adapted to that?
I think that broadcasters see it as a danger. I don't necessarily think that it is as much of a danger as the broadcasters think it is, right? I think that actually there are ways to combat the FANGs, and broadcasters just need to realise what they do best, right? Which is, you know, either live or as close to live, zeitgeisty, of the moment programming that is very suited to a local audience. I mean, you know, sometimes we forget that broadcasters have decades of experience of producing for a local audience, whereas Netflix has zero experience of producing for a Ukrainian audience, you know? They don't know what a Ukrainian audience wants, and often what we find around the world is that people like to see their own lives reflected in the TV that they watch. And this is really interesting because it means that broadcasters have the edge over the FANGs, right? So broadcasters just need to understand what it is they do best. Because
that's the kind of thing, even media in general, you know, when like everybody was shouting at the you know, end of newspapers, of, you know, the press was dead and stuff like that, and even in the CDs and in that kind of media.
It happened with cinema.
Exactly.
When TV first came, you know, when TV first came about, it's going to be the death of cinema.
Yes, indeed.
It's not at all, is it? You know, people still enjoy going to the cinema because it is a different experience. And television is a shared experience, right? It's a scheduled, like people are naturally kind of habitual. People have habits. People will tune in to a show at a certain time because they love doing so. In the UK, we have soaps, which are basically, I suppose they're kind of like a telenovela, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, these are on every night during the week at a certain time. Everybody tunes in, and you know, this is something that people have been doing for decades, and people aren't going to stop doing that because they know there's an appointment to view, and this is what we see.
Now, what do you think that the Western media market can learn from the Ukrainian market today, as of today, as this young emerging market?
I think there's some really original ideas coming from the Ukraine. I think there's, I think particularly in scripted, right? Particularly in the scripted shows that we see, there's a lovely Ukrainian feel, and the stories are bold, they're powerful, but they're also very warm. They're also kind of universal stories. You know, was it last year, or maybe even the year before, we saw Servant of the People was picked up in the USA, you know? And Servant of the People is a very Ukrainian story, it's a very Ukrainian storyline, but actually, it's an international, it is also an international story, and it's, you know, that kind of comedy, particularly at this moment in history, that kind of, you know, political comedy translates very well around the world. And I think this is what Ukraine's very, very strong with, particularly with its scripted shows. I also think that, you know, it's come on leaps and bounds with regard to production techniques. I think that, you know, the production over here is absolutely fantastic. I mean, you know, you see, you know, the Film UA studios, and it's just
absolutely
incredible.
Yeah,
absolutely incredible. So yeah, I think there's a wealth of I think there's a wealth of really interesting content coming from the Ukraine, and I think that internationally people are waking up to this.
Now, and to conclude this interview, if I was to be let's say a young producer, a young showrunner from Ukraine or from the West, what kind of advice would you give me from your point of view, from your stance?
Don't sit still, right? I think that too often in this industry people get, I think too often in this industry people sit still, don't move with the times. You know, I think it's about really looking over what's next, but at the same time, really focus on, you know, if you have an idea for a format, really focus on the development and really try and pull out the human aspect. Don't forget that we create television for people. And I think that sometimes, you know, producers forget that we're actually, you know, there is an audience on the other side that are just normal people, you know, very, very normal people living their lives. And sometimes we forget that that's who our audience is, right, at the end of the day. And so, you know, whether it's unscripted or whether it's scripted, you know, the best examples in these genres are always those shows where humanity shines through, you know? Even going back to a game show like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, it is so popular because at the end of the day, it is about two people, right? It is about the presenter and it is about the person in the hot seat, and that is all that there is there. You know, there are questions, but aside from the questions, that's all there is. That's all you're dealing with, and that's why it's such an interesting watch, because there are these two personalities on stage, on screen, but other than that, there is not a lot. And I think that, you know, people forget and people get too weighed down and convoluted about, you know, oh, this format needs, you know, it needs a nap. It needs
theoretical way.
But, yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. And sometimes, you know, it's overthinked. You've got to be, as Justin Scroggy said yesterday, cleverly simple, I think is key.
Thank you for this overview. It was a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you so much.
That was Ciaramella, Communication Manager at Kyiv Media. Thank you for watching the program, and stay tuned for the rest.